At 18, Alara had already lost her grandfather, her home, and what she had always believed to be the unconditional bedrock of her mother's love, all in the suffocatingly short space of a single gray season. All her mother, Anya, left her was the deed to a rotting boathouse on the forgotten end of the harbor, a place slumped into the marsh like a tired old man, bought from the estate for the insulting sum of $1, and the members of the town council, when they heard, had laughed. But what nobody knew, what nobody could possibly guess, was that the rot was a kind of armor, and the damp, salt-scoured wood held a secret worth more than all the new glass houses blinking on the cliffside combined. That, though, comes later. First, there was the quiet before the storm, the last good days when the world still made a kind of sense. First, there was Silas. Her grandfather was a man made of sea-wrack and patience, his hands a roadmap of healed cuts from fish-hooks and wood splinters, his voice a low rumble like stones rolling in the surf. He smelled of creosote and pipe tobacco and the cold, clean scent of the open water. For 18 years he had been Alara's anchor, the fixed point in her small universe. His house, a small, sturdy cottage just up the hill from the harbor, was the only home she had ever truly known. Her mother was a satellite, orbiting in and out of their lives, a creature of restless energy and sudden, bright enthusiasms that faded as quickly as they appeared. But Silas was constant. He was the tide. He taught her how to read the sky, how to mend a net with a small carved needle, how to listen to the language of the gulls. He taught her that the most important things were often the quietest, the ones that did not demand attention. He had a saying, one he'd repeat while running a hand over the hull of a boat or a piece of driftwood he'd found. "The wood remembers," he would say, his eyes focused on something far away. "It holds the story of the sun and the wind that shaped it. You just have to be still enough to hear it." Alara hadn't understood then, not really, but she loved the sound of the words, the weight of them in the air. She had her own small piece of his work, a little seabird he'd carved for her from a single piece of pale, smooth driftwood when she was 6. It was no bigger than her thumb, worn glassy smooth from years of being held in her pocket, a silent, wooden companion. Then the tide went out and did not come back in. Silas passed in his sleep on a Tuesday in early autumn, as quietly as he had lived. The silence he left behind was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the little cottage. Anya, her mother, arrived the next day, and the silence was replaced by a different kind of emptiness, a brittle, noisy sorrow that had no room for Alara's quiet grief. Anya moved through the house like a storm, bagging up his clothes, his books, his pipes. She spoke of fresh starts and moving on, her words sharp and quick, slicing through the thick air of morning. And with her came Marcus, a man as sleek and polished as the silver car he drove. He was in real estate, he said, with a smile that never reached his eyes, and he saw potential everywhere. He looked at Silas's life, the worn furniture and the mended nets, and saw only liabilities. He appraised the cottage not as a home, but as a teardown on a valuable lot. He measured everything in square footage and return on investment. He and Anya spoke in low, urgent whispers in the kitchen, their voices a discordant hum against the steady rhythm of the waves Alara had grown up with. They took his truck. They took his tools from the shed, the good ones, the ones with worn wooden handles shaped to his grip. They took her from his house, or rather, they took the house from under her, selling it before the last of the autumn leaves had even fallen. Alara felt herself shrinking, becoming a ghost in her own life, a small, overlooked object in a house being cleared for sale. The little wooden bird in her pocket felt heavier than it ever had before. The meeting with the estate lawyer was a blur of cold leather chairs and the dry rustle of paper. Alara sat beside her mother but felt 1,000 miles away. Marcus did all the talking, his voice smooth and reasonable, explaining how Silas had left very little of actual monetary value. The cottage was sold, the proceeds would go to Anya, as his only child. There were debts to be paid, he explained, looking at Alara with a flicker of something like pity, but it was the pity of a wolf for a lamb. Then came the matter of the boathouse. It was on the books. a forgotten asset on the marshy end of the harbor, technically part of the estate. Marcus laughed a little as he described it. A derelict structure, he called it, a hazard. The pilings were rotten, the roof was half gone, and the town had been sending notices about it for years. It would cost more to tear down than the land it sat on was worth. He paused, looking from Anya to Alara, a calculated performance of magnanimity. We were just going to let the town take it for back taxes, he said, spreading his hands. But Anya had an idea. Anya, who had been staring out the window, turned. Her face was a mask of strained composure. You always loved that old place, she said to Alara, her voice flat, devoid of any real warmth. Playing down there with your grandfather. It's not worth anything, but if you want it, it's yours. Marcus slid a document across the polished table. We can transfer the deed for $1. A formality. It absolves the estate of any liability. You'd be taking on the responsibility, of course. It was a banishment gift wrapped as generosity. A final, cutting dismissal. They were not giving her a home. They were giving her a ruin, a burden, a place to disappear to so they could get on with their bright, new, profitable future. They were giving her his forgotten things, the worthless remnants, while they kept the valuable parts. Alara looked at her mother's face, searching for a flicker of the woman who had once tucked her into bed, but there was nothing. Just a stranger looking through her. She thought of Silas, of his calloused hands and his quiet wisdom. He had loved that old boathouse. It was where he did his real work, he'd said, the quiet work. She didn't know what that meant, but she felt a sudden, fierce need to protect it, this last piece of him. To accept their scorn and turn it into a sanctuary. Without a word, she picked up the pen. The ink was a stark, final black against the pale paper. She signed her name, her hands steady. $1. Marcus slid a single, crisp bill from his wallet and passed it to the lawyer with a theatrical flourish. The transaction was complete. That evening, Anya handed her a cardboard box with a few of her clothes and the photograph of her and Silas from her bedside table. You should go now, Alara, she said, not meeting her eyes. Marcus and I have plans. There was no hug, no word of encouragement. Just the closing of a door. Alara stood on the porch of the house she no longer belonged to, the box in her arms, the deed in her pocket, and the small wooden bird clutched in her hand. The sun was setting, bleeding orange and purple across the sky. She did not look back. She walked down the familiar hill, past the shuttered storefronts of the sleepy town, and toward the harbor. The air grew thick with the smell of salt and low tide, a smell that had always meant home. But tonight, it smelled of exile. She saw the boathouse from a distance, a dark shape hunched against the glowing water. It looked even worse than Marcus had described. A skeleton of a building, its bones picked clean by the wind and the sea. The laughter of the council members echoed in her mind. A single dollar, a joke. She stopped at the edge of the rickety pier that led to its door. The tide was out, exposing the slick, moss-covered pilings, many of them leaning at precarious angles. A shutter banged a lonely rhythm in the breeze. This was it. This was everything she had left. She took a deep breath, the cold, damp air filling her lungs, and she took the first step onto the groaning boards. She was home. She found him waiting for her, a loyal gray shadow in the deepening twilight. Skipper, her grandfather's old retriever, was curled on the weathered threshold of the boathouse, his muzzle resting on his paws. He lifted his head as she approached, his tail giving a few slow, tired thumps against the wood. He was old, his eyes clouded with age, his coat the color of a stormy sea, but he had waited. He hadn't followed Anya to the clean, sterile house she was making. He had come here, to the last place that still held the scent of his master. Alara knelt and buried her face in his thick, wiry fur. He smelled of salt and dog, and a deep, unwavering loyalty that felt like the only true thing left in the world. For the first time since Silas had died, she let herself cry, her shoulders shaking with silent, ragged sobs. The old dog just licked the tears from her cheeks, whining softly, a low, comforting sound in the vast quiet of the harbor. He was her first and only ally. Together, they pushed open the heavy door, its hinges groaning in protest. The inside was one large, cavernous room, plunged into near darkness. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of damp earth and rotting wood and something else, something sharper, the ghost of old varnish and sawdust. What little light filtered through the grimy windows revealed a space in chaos. Old nets were piled in a corner, stiff with dried salt. Rusted cans and broken bits of tackle littered the floor. A thick layer of dust and grime covered every surface. In the center of the room, a massive shape loomed under a heavy canvas tarp. It was the skeleton of a small boat, a dory, its ribs exposed to the air, a project Silas had started and never finished. Her inheritance was not a house, it was a tomb, filled with the ghosts of forgotten work. The next morning, the reality of her situation settled in with the cold, damp light. She had no money, save for a few dollars crumpled in her pocket. She had a box of clothes, an old dog, and a building that felt like it might collapse in the next strong wind. She started with the simple things, the tasks that required effort, not money. She swept. For hours, she swept away the years of dust and neglect, the spiders and their brittle webs, the debris left by the tide and time. As she worked, a figure appeared at the far end of the pier, a stooped man with a fisherman's cap pulled low over his eyes. He walked with the slow, deliberate gait of someone who had spent a lifetime on unsteady surfaces. He stopped a few feet from the door, watching her. "Heard you took the place," he said, his voice raspy. It was Finn, the owner of the bait and tackle shop at the head of the harbor, a man whose face was as weathered as the coastline. He had known Silas for 50 years. Elara nodded, leaning on the broom, suddenly self-conscious of her dirty clothes and the mess surrounding her. Finn looked past her, into the dim interior of the boathouse. His gaze was sad and knowing. "Lot of work," he observed. It wasn't a question. "I have time," she said, her voice small. He grunted, a sound that was not unkind. He held out a steaming styrofoam cup. "Coffee," he said. "Figured you could use it." She took it, her cold fingers wrapping around its warmth. It was the first gesture of kindness she had received in weeks. "Your grandfather," Finn said, his eyes scanning the rotting walls. "He was a good man. Quieter than most. Saw things others didn't." He paused, looking directly at her. "Folks around here, they think this place is just junk. Silas never did. He called it his workshop, his real workshop." He took a long look at the far wall, the one that faced out toward the open sea, his brow furrowed in thought. He spent more time on that back wall than on the rest of the building combined. Always tinkering with it. Strange. He shrugged, as if shaking off a memory he couldn't quite grasp. "Well, if you need anything, a hammer, some nails, you know where to find me." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving Elara with the warm coffee and a new puzzle to consider. The back wall. After he left, she examined it more closely. Finn was right. The rest of the boathouse was a hodgepodge of mismatched planks, warped boards, and rough-hewn timbers. But the back wall, a section about 10 feet wide, was different. It was constructed of a darker, richer wood, something that had resisted the rot and the damp far better than the surrounding pine and fir. The planks were fitted together with a shipwright's precision, the seams so tight you couldn't slip a knife blade between them. It was beautiful, sturdy, and completely out of place in the ramshackle structure. She ran her hand over its smooth, cool surface. It felt solid, ancient. She knocked on it. The sound was a dull, solid thud, not the hollow echo she expected. It was as if she were knocking on solid rock. It made no sense. Why would her grandfather, a man known for his practicality, pour so much effort and expensive material into one small section of a failing building? The question settled in her mind, a small, persistent anchor. She had a roof to patch and windows to clean, and a life to somehow build from nothing. But her gaze kept returning to that strange, silent wall. It was an anomaly, a secret hiding in plain sight. And in a world that had taken everything from her, the promise of a secret, of something known only to her and her grandfather, was a lifeline. The days took on a shape, a rhythm dictated by the tides and the slow, arduous work of reclamation. Alara learned to live with almost nothing, a lesson in essentials. She ate cheap tins of beans and fish Finn would leave on her doorstep without comment. She learned that a patched roof, even one that still dripped in a few places, felt like a luxury after a night spent watching the stars through a gaping hole. She learned the groan of every board, the specific way the wind whistled through a crack in the west-facing window. The boathouse was no longer just a structure, it was a living thing, and she was learning its language. Skipper was her constant shadow, a warm, reassuring presence at her feet. In the evenings, she would sit on the edge of the pier with the old dog, his head in her lap, and watch the lights of the town flicker on, feeling like an island unto herself. The townspeople, the other fishermen and shopkeepers, kept their distance. She saw them watching her from their boats or from the windows of the harbor cafe. She could feel their pity, their skepticism. A slip of a girl trying to hold back the tide with a broom and a borrowed hammer. They saw a fool's errand, a sentimental gesture doomed to fail. They saw Anya's daughter, the girl who had been cast off with the family rubbish. They did not see the quiet resolve hardening within her, a strength forged in loss and solitude. She was not just fixing a building, she was piecing herself back together, one nail, one board at a time. She found her grandfather's old workbench tucked away under the tarp with the unfinished dory. It had been spared in her mother's purge, deemed too big and worthless to move. The surface was scarred with the marks of countless projects, gouges from slipped chisels, rings from forgotten cups of coffee. In a drawer, she found a few of his simpler tools, a block plane with a blade that was still razor-sharp, a set of worn carving knives, a small handsaw. She ran her fingers over the smooth wooden handle of the plane, a handle shaped by decades of his grip. Holding it felt like holding his hand. She began to use them, not because she had a plan, but because the work felt necessary, elemental. She planed warped boards until they were smooth, sawed new patches for the floor, her movements clumsy at first, then more certain. The scent of fresh-cut wood began to mingle with the old smells of salt and decay, a scent of renewal. And as she worked, his words would come back to her, unbidden. The wood remembers. She would say it to herself, a mantra against the loneliness, against the overwhelming scale of the task. She felt his presence not as a ghost, but as a quiet encouragement in the grain of the wood, in the heft of the tools. She was not just occupying his space, she was continuing his work, breathing life back into the thing he had loved. The wall remained a constant presence, a silent challenge. Every day, she would finish her work on the roof or the floor, and spend an hour with the wall, running her hands over its surface, searching for a clue. She measured it. She checked it with a level. It was perfect. Too perfect. One afternoon, while sanding a patch on the floor nearby, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A knot in one of the dark planks, low to the ground, almost hidden in the shadows. It was a small, tight whorl in the grain, but there was something about its shape that was strangely familiar. It was the deliberate, stylized shape of a bird's eye. She pulled the small, carved seabird from her pocket. She had carried it for 12 years. Its surface was worn to a soft gleam, but the carved eye was still distinct. She held it up to the knot in the wall. They were identical. It wasn't a knot. It was a carving made to look like one, a piece of signature artistry so subtle it was nearly invisible. Her heart began to pound, a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was it. This was the key, Her grandfather, the quiet man who saw things others didn't, had left her a message, a secret hidden in the language they had shared, the language of wood. Her fingers trembled as she reached out and pressed the carved bird's eye. For a moment, nothing happened. The wall remained solid, impassive. A wave of disappointment washed over her, so sharp it felt like grief. Had she imagined it all? Was it just a piece of wood? A coincidence? Another dead end? She pressed again, harder this time, pushing her thumb into the small indentation with all the desperate hope she had left. There was a soft, deep click, a sound of old, well-oiled tumblers engaging somewhere deep within the wall. A vertical seam, utterly invisible moments before, appeared in the center of the dark planks. The seam widened, and a section of the wall, about 4 feet wide, swung inward with a quiet, sighing sound, revealing not a room, but a deep, perfectly constructed cavity, a hidden chamber inside the wall itself. The air that drifted out was cool and dry, smelling faintly of cedar and old paper. It was a clean smell, a smell of preservation, a stark contrast to the damp decay of the rest of the boathouse. The interior of the chamber was lined with thin cedar slats, and it was filled, from floor to ceiling, with shelves. And on the shelves, arranged in neat, silent rows, were boxes. Dozens and dozens of them. They were small, exquisitely crafted wooden keepsake boxes, each one different. Some were made of dark walnut, others of pale maple, others of rich red cherry. The craftsmanship was breathtaking. Each lid was inlaid with a delicate design, a shell, a star, a feather, or carved with a simple, elegant pattern. They were beautiful, but it was the inscription on the front of each box that made Ilara's breath catch in her throat. Each one bore a name and a set of dates. Names she recognized. The names of children from the town, children who had been lost over the years, to illness, to accidents, to the unforgiving sea. Children who were now just faint, sad memories, names on old gravestones. This was not a treasure of gold or money. It was something else entirely. Beneath the shelves of boxes, on a wider ledge at the bottom of the chamber, sat a stack of thick, leather-bound logbooks, their covers worn with age. They looked like old fishing logs, the kind her grandfather had always kept. She reached in and lifted the topmost book. It was heavy, solid, filled with his familiar spidery handwriting. She opened it to the first page. The entry was dated 50 years ago. It did not mention tides or weather or the day's catch. It read, Thomas Albright, 1958 to 1964. A toy boat, carved from pine. He loved the harbor. She gently lifted the lid of the box labeled with the same name. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded blue velvet, was a perfect, hand-carved miniature dory, its paint slightly chipped, as if from years of imaginary voyages. It was a memorial, a secret, silent act of remembrance for a lost child. She sank to her knees on the dusty floor, the open book in her lap, the small wooden boat in her hand. The sheer, staggering scale of it washed over her. The quiet man who barely spoke, the man everyone thought was just a simple fisherman, had been carrying the town's grief for half a century, transforming it, piece by piece, into these small, beautiful acts of love and memory. He had built a library of sorrows. If you have stayed with this story this far, stay a little longer, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. This was not just the story of a girl and a boathouse, it was the story of a town's hidden heart, and how the quietest man in it had been its secret keeper all along. And now, the keeper's key had been passed to his granddaughter. Ilara spent the entire night in the quiet company of the ghosts her grandfather had honored. With Skipper curled at her side, a warm, breathing anchor in the vastness of the discovery, she read the logbooks by the light of a single kerosene lamp. The flame cast long, dancing shadows across the room, making the rows of boxes seem to breathe in the darkness. The books were not fishing logs. They were a testament. Each entry was a small, heartbreaking biography, a name, a set of dates, and a few simple, carefully chosen words that captured the essence of a life cut short. Sarah Jenkins, 1972 to 1979. A likeness of her rag doll, Sally, made from applewood. Leo Peterson, 1988 to 1994. A starfish, like the one he found on the North Beach. Maple. Daniel Walker, 1999 to 2001. A small yellow truck. He loved the color yellow. With each entry, she would find the corresponding box and open it. Inside each one was a perfect, tangible piece of a memory. A tiny carved rocking horse, a delicate feather whittled from birch, a sleeping kitten, its wooden form so lifelike she could almost feel it purr. The level of detail, the love poured into each object was overwhelming. Silas, who had lost his own daughter, Alara's grandmother, when she was just a child, had found a way to channel his own unending grief. He had not built a monument of stone. He had built a sanctuary of small, remembered things. He had given these lost children a place to be remembered not for how they died, but for what they had loved. He had done it all in secret. No one knew. He never sought thanks or recognition. He simply saw a need, a silence that needed to be filled not with words, but with quiet, patient work. The logbooks were a secret history of the town, a map of its deepest heartaches. As she read, Alara began to understand the man she thought she knew in a way she never had before. His quietness was not emptiness. It was a vessel holding the sorrows of others. His long hours spent alone in the boathouse were not a retreat from the world, but a deep engagement with its most painful truths. The strange, fortified wall was not just a hiding place. It was a vault, built to protect the most precious things in town. Not gold, but memories. The phrase he had always used, "the wood remembers," was not a simple proverb. It was his mission statement. He made the wood remember for those who were struggling to forget the pain, but desperate to hold on to the love. By dawn, she had read through all the books. Her eyes were raw from reading and from tears, but she felt a profound sense of clarity. This boathouse was not hers to simply fix up and live in. It was a trust. A sacred duty had been passed to her. She now understood why he had let the rest of the building fall into disrepair. All of his energy, all of his best materials, had gone into protecting his secret work. The rot was a disguise, a form of camouflage that kept the world at bay. The world saw a derelict building. He had built a temple. As the first rays of sun slanted through the grimy windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, Alara carefully closed the last logbook. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she could not sell this place. She could not let it be torn down. She had to protect it, just as he had. But she was an 18-year-old girl with no money and no power. And she had a feeling that the world, with its bulldozers and its balance sheets, was not going to make it easy. The polished smile of Marcus and the empty eyes of her mother loomed in her memory. They saw only a worthless piece of land. How could she possibly make them understand that it was the most valuable place in the entire town? Her newfound purpose was tested sooner than she could have imagined. A week later, just as she had finished patching the last major hole in the roof, the sleek, silver car pulled up at the end of the pier. Marcus and her mother got out, their city shoes looking comically out of place on the weathered planks. Marcus wore a crisp suit, Anya a stylish coat that seemed designed to ward off more than just the sea breeze. They looked like visitors from another planet. Alara met them at the door, her hands stained with wood varnish, her clothes smudged with dirt. She felt a flicker of the old shame, the feeling of being small and insignificant in their polished world. But it was quickly replaced by a cold, steady resolve. "Alara," her mother began, her voice tight with forced pleasantness. "You've certainly been busy." She glanced around the interior, her nose wrinkling slightly at the lingering smell of damp wood and kerosene. Marcus stepped forward, all business and predatory charm. "We have some wonderful news," he said, beaming. "A developer, a very prominent one, is interested in the entire harbor front. He's planning a beautiful new marina, some condos, a restaurant. It's a fantastic opportunity for the whole town." He paused for effect. "He's made a very generous offer for this entire stretch, including this lot." He looked at her as if expecting her to be thrilled. "Our properties are tied together in the sale," he continued, his tone becoming more serious. "We need your signature to complete the parcel. The developer is prepared to offer you $5,000 for your trouble. A nice little nest egg to get you started somewhere new. A threat wrapped in a transaction. A dismissal sweetened with a pittance. $5,000 for her grandfather's life's work." The insult was so profound, it almost made her laugh. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the space between them with the force of a slammed door. Marcus's smile faltered. "I don't think you understand, Alara. This isn't really a negotiation. This place is a condemned wreck. We're offering you a gift." "I understand perfectly," she said, her gaze steady. "The answer is no. This boathouse is not for sale." Anya stepped forward, her composure finally cracking. "Don't be a fool, Alara. What could you possibly want with this pile of sticks? It's falling into the sea. Take the money and make a life for yourself. Your grandfather wouldn't have wanted you living like this." "You don't know what he would have wanted," Alara said, her voice dropping, laced with a sorrow that was older than her years. "You didn't know him at all." The truth of the statement struck her mother like a physical blow. Anya flinched, her face paling. Marcus, however, was merely annoyed. His charm had failed, so he switched to intimidation. "Fine," he snapped, his voice turning hard. "If you want to be difficult, you should know that I took the liberty of speaking with the town planning board. They are quite concerned about the structural integrity of this building. In fact, they've issued a demolition order, effective in 30 days. Unless you can prove that this structure is historically significant or sound enough to be brought up to code, they will tear it down. And you will get nothing." He smiled that cold, empty smile again. 30 days, Alara. The clock is ticking. We'll get the land one way or another." They turned and walked away, leaving the ultimatum hanging in the air. 30 days. It was an impossible deadline. She had no resources, no allies, no way to fight the money and influence of a man like Marcus. For a moment, panic seized her. The weight of the secret, the responsibility she felt, seemed too heavy to bear. She retreated into the boathouse, the sound of their car fading into the distance. She leaned against the cool, solid wood of the hidden chamber. She could feel the presence of the boxes inside, the silent weight of all those remembered lives. She was not alone in this fight. She had an army of ghosts at her back. She just had to find a way to make the world see them. She knew she couldn't do it alone. The secret was too big, and the threat was too immediate. She needed an ally, someone who understood the town's history, someone who had the respect of the community. She thought of Finn. Tucked away in the last of the logbooks, nestled between the final entry and the back cover, she had found something else. A sealed envelope, with her name written on it in her grandfather's familiar script. Her hands had shaken as she opened it. It was a letter, a final message from the man who had been her whole world. The ink was slightly faded, the paper soft with age. "My dearest Ilara," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you found my real work. I am sorry for the burden of it, but I knew of no one else I could trust with the memories. When I lost your grandmother, the world went quiet. I thought I would drown in the silence. Then, little Tommy Albright was taken by the fever. I saw his parents in the market, hollowed out by their grief, and I knew their silence was the same as mine. I couldn't bring their boy back, but I could make something for him. A little boat. Something to hold the memory of his joy. It helped. It didn't fix the sorrow, but it gave it a shape, a place to rest. So I kept doing it. For 50 years, I tried to build a small dam against the forgetting. This boathouse is not a building, my girl. It is a library of sorrows, a place to hold what the sea and the world have taken. It is proof that every life, no matter how small or how short, leaves a mark. I trust you will know what to do with it. Do not be afraid. You are stronger than you think. And remember, family is not always the blood you share. It's the people who show up to hold the memory alongside you. He had signed it simply, your grandfather, Silas. The letter was both a blessing and a charge. Family is who shows up. She knew what she had to do. With the letter folded carefully in her pocket, she chose one of the boxes from the wall. It was a small, simple one made of weathered pine. The name on the front read, Michael O'Connell, 1961 to 1968. She carried it in both hands, as if it were a fragile, living thing, and walked the length of the harbor to Finn's Bait and Tackle. The shop was a cluttered, wonderful place that smelled of brine and coffee and old wood. Finn was behind the counter, mending a net, his gnarled fingers moving with practiced ease. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. She placed the box on the counter between them without a word. He stared at it. He traced the name with his forefinger, his hand hesitating for a moment. He looked up at her, his eyes narrowed in confusion. "My brother," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Mickey. He drowned. Fell off the pier when we were kids." Ilara gently lifted the lid of the box. Inside, nestled on faded cotton, was a small, perfectly carved seagull, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. Finn stared at the carving, his face crumbling. The tough, salty facade he showed the world dissolved, revealing a grief he had carried for over 60 years. He reached out a trembling hand and picked up the wooden bird. "He loved the gulls," Finn whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "He used to say they were the freest things in the world." He finally looked up at Ilara, his eyes shining. "Silas," he breathed. "It was Silas." Ilara nodded, pulling the letter from her pocket. She didn't need to explain. Finn understood everything. The story spread through the small town like a fire in a dry field. Finn, his voice charged with a lifetime of repressed sorrow and newfound wonder, told the first few fishermen who came into his shop. They, in turn, told their wives, their neighbors. The news traveled over backyard fences and across the counters of the town's few shops. By evening, the whole town was buzzing. It was a story of quiet decency, of a secret so profound and so selfless it humbled everyone who heard it. The next morning, the community chorus began to arrive. The first was old Mrs. Gable, whose daughter Sarah had been memorialized with the Applewood doll. She came with a basket of fresh bread and a thermos of hot soup, her eyes red from crying, but her smile was one of pure, unadulterated gratitude. Then came Mr. Peterson, the stoic carpenter, who had lost his grandson Leo. He didn't say a word. He just unloaded a stack of new lumber from his truck and set to work replacing the rotten pilings under the boathouse. He was followed by others. A roofer with a bundle of shingles, an electrician who offered to wire the place for free, a group of fishermen who spent the day scraping and painting the exterior. They were the people who had pitied her, the ones who had whispered about the foolish girl in the rotting shack. Now they came not with pity, but with reverence. They came to pay a debt to a man who had asked for nothing and to support the girl who was now the keeper of his legacy. They were the family Silas had written about, the ones who showed up. The day of the town council meeting arrived gray and overcast, the sky the color of wet slate. The small meeting hall was packed, standing room only. It was usually a sleepy affair, attended by a few dedicated gadflies, but tonight, the room was filled with the faces of the town. Fishermen in their work clothes, shopkeepers, elderly women, young families. They were not there for a debate on zoning ordinances. They were there to bear witness. Marcus and a man in an expensive suit, the developer, stood at the front of the room next to a large, glossy architectural rendering of the proposed marina. It was all glass and steel and gleaming white boats, a vision of a future that had no room for an old wooden boathouse. Marcus began his presentation, his voice slick and confident. He spoke of progress, of economic growth, of tax revenues. He pointed to the rendering. "This is the future of our harbor," he declared. He then gestured dismissively toward the back of the room, where Alara stood quietly with Finn. "And to achieve that future, we must be willing to clear away the past." He described the boathouse as a public nuisance, an eyesore, a dangerous, condemned structure. He called Alara a stubborn, sentimental child, standing in the way of prosperity for the entire community. He finished with a flourish, smiling at the council members, confident of his victory. "The demolition order is in place. We are simply asking the council to expedite it so we can all move forward." The council chairman, a man who ran the local hardware store, cleared his throat. "Miss Alara," he said, his voice hesitant, "do you have anything to say in response?" Alara walked to the front of the room. She did not have glossy renderings or promises of profit. She had a worn leather logbook in her hands. "Mr. Marcus is right about one thing," she began, her voice clear and steady, filling the silent room. "The boathouse is full of the past. It's full of memories." She opened the book. "He calls it a pile of sticks. My grandfather called it a library." She began to read the names. Thomas Albright, Sarah Jenkins, Leo Peterson, Michael O'Connell. With each name, a murmur went through the crowd. Faces tightened. People nodded, remembering. She did not read the details of the carvings. She didn't need to. The names themselves were enough. Then Finn stood up, his tall, stooped frame commanding attention. "My brother's name is in that book," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "For 60 years, I thought the sea was the only thing that held his memory. I was wrong. Silas did. He held it for me. For all of us." Then Mrs. Gable stood. "My Sarah is in there." Then Mr. Peterson. "And my Leo." One by one, people began to stand, a silent, powerful testament. Men and women whose faces were etched with old grief stood in solidarity, their presence a rebuke to the talk of profit and progress. The room was no longer a council meeting. It had become a memorial. The glossy rendering of the marina seemed to shrink, to become cheap and meaningless in the face of this profound, shared history. The developer looked deeply uncomfortable. Marcus's confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of disbelief. He had measured the boathouse in dollars and wrought, and had failed to see its true value. He had underestimated the power of what it held. Then, from the side of the room, a new voice spoke, trembling but clear. "My father's name is in that book too." It was Anya. She stood up, her face pale, tears streaming down her cheeks. The mask of the polished, detached woman she had become was gone, stripped away by the raw, undeniable truth in the room. "Not as a child he carved for," she clarified, her voice breaking, "but as the man who did the carving." She looked directly at Alara, her eyes filled with a shame so deep it was painful to watch. "I am his daughter, and I helped to sell his home. I let this man," she gestured toward Marcus, "convince me that my father's life was worth nothing more than the land it sat on. I was so lost in my own grief, so eager to erase the pain, that I tried to erase him. And I threw away the most precious thing he left behind, my own daughter." She took a step toward Alara. "I am so sorry," she whispered, the words a raw confession in front of the entire town. "I was wrong. That boathouse is not a ruin. It's my father's heart, and it belongs with you." The redemption of Anya was not loud or dramatic, but a quiet, painful unfolding. It began not with words, but with work. The day after the council meeting, from which Marcus and the developer had slunk away in defeat, Anya appeared at the boathouse. She was not wearing a stylish coat, but old jeans and a worn sweater. She didn't offer grand apologies or emotional speeches. She simply picked up a piece of sandpaper and began to work on a section of wall, her movements clumsy at first, then more sure. Ilara watched her for a long time, then went back to her own work, planing a new board for the floor. They worked in silence for hours, the scrape of sandpaper and the whisper of the block plane the only sounds between them, a conversation more honest than any words they could have spoken. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to rebuild more than just the boathouse. Anya began to make amends through humble labor, showing up every day, sanding, varnishing, cleaning. She was learning the language of the wood, the language of her father, and in doing so, was learning to speak to her daughter again. The town, for its part, officially declared the boathouse a protected historical site, the Silas Cole Memorial Library, ensuring it would stand for generations. The offers from developers ceased, the threat was gone. The boathouse was no longer a place of rot and decay, but a clean, quiet sanctuary filled with light. The interior was simple and reverent. The unfinished dory had been completed by the town's fishermen, and now hung from the rafters, a tribute to its maker. The hidden chamber was left open, the rows of boxes on display for any who needed to visit a memory. It was not a museum, but a living place, a testament to the fact that love is stronger than loss. The found family that had cohered around the project remained. Finn would bring coffee every morning. Mr. Peterson would stop by to check on the structural soundness of the pilings. Mrs. Gable would deliver baked goods. They were the unofficial guardians, the family who had shown up. Ilara had found her place, not just in the boathouse, but in the heart of the community. She had refused the easy money, had chosen meaning over profit, and in doing so, had saved not just a building, but a piece of the town's soul. Months later, as a warm spring settled over the harbor, news came of a tragedy. A new family, one who had just moved to town, had lost their young son in a car accident. The town was cloaked in a fresh, raw grief. That evening, Ilara sat at her grandfather's workbench, the place where she now felt most at home. Skipper, even older and grayer now, rested his head on her knee. The scent of cedar and salt filled the air. She looked at the rows of boxes, at the testament to her grandfather's 50 years of quiet compassion. The work was not finished. It would never be finished, as long as there was love and loss in the world. She picked up a clean, pale block of driftwood she had found on the beach that morning. She took one of her grandfather's carving knives from the rack. The worn wooden handle felt warm and familiar in her hand, a perfect fit. She took a deep breath, and with a steady, practiced motion, she made the first cut. She was not just carving wood. She was continuing the work. She was holding a memory. The legacy was alive. The wood, as it always had, would remember.